While scouring eBay a few weeks ago, I found a Badger 200 NH single action airbrush for under $20 plus shipping. At first glance, it looked to be in good shape, minus the noticeably dry paint inside the siphon chamber. Come on people, flush your airbrushes. Dang. Anyway, it seemed like a good deal. Too good in fact. The description said it was in used condition, but no mention if it was in actual working condition. However, upon a closer look at the pics, the airbrush was clearly missing the trigger button. I had a gut feeling this was a perfectly good airbrush. Judging from the pics alone, it seemed to be hardly used and would probably work properly if it just had the trigger button. I was pretty hyped on this find. This was the newer style Badger 200 with the same head design as an Anthem or a Patriot 105 airbrush. New, they cost somewhere between $60 to $70, depending on the accessories, and replacement parts for Badger airbrushes are readily available in the US. A trigger button cost under $10 shipped on Amazon, and a replacement Badger 1/4 ounce metal color cup cost under $11. Seems kinda pricey for a cup if you ask me, but you can get the Pache metal color cup for a few dollars less and it will work just fine, or get 10 generic siphon feed bottles for under $18. For most, this airbrush would not be worth it because the cost of the airbrush plus the replacement parts would equal out to about $45, which is about the same for a used one in perfect working condition with all the accessories. Luckily for me, I already had these parts at home, so with that, I decided to buy the airbrush. I live for these deals, and that's how you can tell my social life is in shambles. A few days later, the airbrush arrived in a well-packed bubble mailer. My first impression of the airbrush is that it looks better in person than it did on the eBay pictures. Minus the missing trigger, it almost looks brand new, with very little wear. But after a quick inspection, there is cured white paint on the air cap and cured red paint inside the siphon tube. After rummaging through my spares box, I found a spare trigger from another Badger airbrush I own. I know the package says it's a high roller trigger, but it's actually just the standard trigger I swapped from my Sotar 2020 airbrush. Since most Badger airbrushes nowadays use the same trigger design, it should be 100% compatible. The trigger button has a small hole in the shaft that the needle threads through. To install the trigger, I remove the needle by removing the entire handle assembly. And simply I drop in the trigger with the hole facing the direction of the needle. The air valve feels nice and springy, seems to be in working order. I then reinstalled the needle. The needle is the only thing that keeps the trigger in place, so it is a bit easy for the trigger to fall off the body and get lost when you take out the needle for cleaning. With the trigger button installed, I can now actually test it with air to make sure it actually works. To do so, I gotta hook it up to my air hose quick disconnects and then to my benchtop airbrush compressor with the pressure set at about 40 psi. The trigger and air valve seem to be working, but it sounds a bit quiet, like there's only a small amount of air coming out of the nozzle, nowhere near 40 psi. I suspect the white paint we saw on the air cap earlier is clogging the nozzle area, so just to be sure, I remove the air cap and try again. Yup, plenty of air this time, which means it's gonna need a good cleaning. To begin, I'll start by using distilled water and window cleaner. This will usually remove water-based paints like Vallejo acrylics. But after a few minutes, this didn't seem to be doing much to the red and white paint. Next, I tried dipping a cotton swab in some 91% isopropyl alcohol, and that seemed to start dissolving the red paint. However, the white paint was unfazed and the alcohol proved ineffective. By now I realized the airbrush was going to need a thorough cleaning anyway, so I opted to disassemble it. I begin by removing the needle along with the needle adjusting screw. Then I remove the handle and pull off the trigger. Next, I screw off the air valve assembly and inspect the valve plunger for wear. The tip seems nice and sharp. Usually this part dulls out a bit with usage, but this one seems almost brand new, so that's good. Then I removed the gunked up air cap and head cap. The self-censoring nozzle tip should come right off, but in this case the nozzle was pretty stuck as the cure paint was acting like a sort of glue. A few drops of lacquer thinner and very light pressure eased the nozzle from the seat. Yeah, it was pretty gunked up. Next, I'm only gonna soak the parts that are gunked up. I place the parts inside a small 4-ounce jar and pour enough alcohol to fully submerge the parts. I cap the jar and let them soak for a couple of hours. After they've soaked, I pour the parts into an ultrasonic cleaner and fill it halfway with more 91% isopropyl alcohol. Then I set the timer for 30 minutes. But even after all that, the white paint remained unfazed. Even the red paint just managed to get all gummy and clumpy. No matter how much I scrubbed, the white paint just wouldn't budge. Also, it just seemed like an endless amount of red paint was still stuck inside the shell too. Frustrated by this, I wasn't going to hold back any longer. I brought out the strongest solvent I have, Burt's Beeswax Face and Skin Toner. This stuff is no joke. It's guaranteed to remove most pigments while leaving your skin nice and refreshed. And sure enough, a small drop was enough to begin dissolving the white paint. Look at it just flake off. This stuff is no joke. I'd never use this on my face. I'm just messing with y'all. That's actually DT5 virgin lacquer thinner that I poured in that small Burt's glass bottle so I wouldn't have to pour small amounts of lacquer thinner from that large 1-gallon container. Anyway, I placed the parts back into the ultrasonic cleaner, but this time I filled it with 8 ounces of lacquer thinner. I then set the timer for 10 minutes. And this time, the parts came out nice and clean. They look brand new. Look at all those chunks that came out of the airbrush. It was really dirty. Just a quick note, lacquer thinner is good for multiple uses. I usually just filter out the used thinner using one of these paint strainers. And then I store it in a small jar to reuse later. After straining the parts, I set them on this absorbent pad to dry. I inspect the parts to make sure no paint remains as well. They all look paint-free and nice and clean. The ultrasonic cleaner works wonders. These parts look brand new. I shoot some compressed air with another airbrush to help speed up the drying process before reassembly. Assembly is easy. I begin by inserting the nozzle tip into the seat on the shell. Then I screw on the head cap followed by the air cap and snug it up by hand. You don't need a ton of force as this can cause the threads to warp or even strip. Next, I screw on the air valve assembly and hand tighten it as well. Then I insert the trigger button with the hole facing the direction of the needle and screw on the handle. And finally, I reinstall the needle by screwing on the needle adjustment screw. And that's that, good as new. Theoretically, it should all work perfectly, but just to be sure, I'm gonna do a couple of tests. First, I'm going to run some water through it to check out the spray pattern. Nice, trigger is working smoothly and there's plenty of air. Open it up a bit. Yep, it's working well. It seems to be optimizing the water rather nicely. I like it. The spray pattern is consistent and opens up well throughout the needle adjustment range. And now for a more realistic test. I'm gonna run this nice Mr. Color GX green through the airbrush thinned at 1:1 ratio or 1 part thinner, 1 part paint. I rarely get to use this nice green, so I'm stoked. I like to use the small 1/4 ounce metal cups instead of the siphon bottles when spraying smaller quantities of paint. First, I'll do practice lines on this note card. Please excuse my sloppy technique. Airbrush lines are not my forte. This paint is a bit too thick for pencil lines and is splattering a bit. But with proper thinning, the Badger 200 should be able to do nice and consistent pencil lines. Thicker lines are no problem. Spraying a few dots also reveals a nice consistent round pattern. Next, a base coat coverage test. I like to use spoons for this as this sort of replicates the size and feel of spraying Gunpla parts. Again, my technique is sloppy here and not really doing the airbrush justice. However, the airbrush performs very well. It atomizes the paint very nicely and lays down a nice consistent pink coat with minimal orange peel. It performs similarly to my Patriot 105 airbrush. Not bad at all. So in conclusion, did I get ripped off? Not by a long shot. Because I already had the spare trigger and color cut from other airbrushes I own, I managed to get a quality US made airbrush for just under 25 bucks. That's on par with some of the nicer Chinese airbrushes out there. However, with proper care, the Badger 200NH airbrush will outlast and outperform most cheapy Chinese airbrushes and will last you a lifetime. And after this experience, I now understand why it's been loved and praised by many scale modelers for decades. It's a great airbrush. Because this is still a small channel, at the beginning of March, YouTube took away the factory's partnership. As a result, the factory hasn't been getting much exposure lately. So if you like the video, please like, share, and subscribe. This will help out the channel so much. Also, check out the factory's Instagram and Twitter for updates in between videos. If you're feeling generous and like to support the factory directly, check out the new Patreon page. I'd be eternally grateful. That's it for this Let's Fix It episode. Thanks for sticking to the end, and I hope to see you here on the next video.